She was sitting on the front steps of my house when I pulled into the driveway. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, the kind of cold that settles into your bones before you even step out of the car. The sky over Oakville had already gone dark by 5 o'clock, the way it does in Ontario this time of year, and my headlights caught her before anything else did. My daughter-in-law, Margaret, sitting on the concrete steps with my 2 grandchildren pressed against either side of her. The older one, Thomas, was 8. The little one, Claire, had just turned 5 in September. They were wearing their school backpacks. There were 2 large suitcases on the walkway beside them, and a garbage bag that looked like it had been packed in a hurry. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment. I did not panic. I want to be clear about that. When you have lived 63 years, when you have buried a husband and built something from nothing and watched this world show you exactly what it is capable of, you stop panicking. You get quiet instead. And in that quiet, you think. I got out of the car. Margaret looked up at me. Her eyes were red, but she was not crying anymore. She had the look of someone who had already used up all her tears on the drive over and was now just sitting in the wreckage of whatever had happened. Thomas stared at the ground. Claire was hugging a stuffed rabbit to her chest and watching me with the kind of wide, careful eyes that children get when they know something is very wrong but cannot name it. I said, "Come inside, all of you." Margaret started to speak, to explain, to apologize. I could tell by the way she drew in her breath, and I shook my head. "Inside first," I said. "There's time to talk." I picked up one of the suitcases and carried it to the door. Inside, I put the kettle on. I found the tin of shortbread I kept in the second cupboard and set it on the kitchen table for the children. I poured Claire a glass of apple juice and asked Thomas if he wanted milk or juice, and he said milk in a very small voice. I moved through my own kitchen the way I always have, steadily, without rushing, and I let the ordinary sounds of it fill the room. The kettle heating, the cupboard closing, the refrigerator humming. By the time I sat down across from Margaret, the children had each taken a cookie and gone quiet in the way children do when they are warm and fed and being held by the familiar smell of a house they have visited all their lives. I folded my hands on the table and looked at her. "Tell me everything," I said. She told me. It took a long time. She stopped several times. She looked at the table and then at the window and then at me, and I let her find her way through it without interrupting, because I have learned that the most important thing you can do for someone who is trying to tell you something painful is simply to stay still and let them. My son, David, had died 14 months earlier, a sudden cardiac event, the doctor had called it. He was 41 years old. He had been at the gym on a Saturday morning and he had not come home. That was the word that kept repeating in my head for months afterward, not come home, because it was the most ordinary phrase and the most devastating thing. He had simply not come home. David had been a partner at his brother's real estate development firm. His brother, my other son, Richard, had founded the company 12 years earlier, and David had joined him 6 years later, putting in a significant portion of his own savings as buy-in capital. They had built it together. That was what I believed. That was what David had told me. That was what Richard had told me at every family dinner for 6 years. After David died, Richard had approached Margaret about David's share of the company. She had been grieving. She had 2 small children. She had been in no condition to read legal documents carefully, and Richard had known that. He had brought papers to her home 3 weeks after the funeral. He had sat in David's living room, in David's chair, and he had told her that the partnership agreement required her to sell David's shares back to the company at fair market value upon the death of a partner. He had told her this was standard. He had told her the valuation had already been done by an independent firm. She had signed. It was only 8 months later, when she had gone back to work and her head had cleared enough to start asking questions, that she began to notice things that did not add up. The independent valuation firm that Richard had cited was a company she could not find any record of online. The amount she had received for David's shares was significantly below what she would have expected based on the company's revenues, which were public record through Ontario's business registry. She had hired a lawyer, a real one, with an office on Lakeshore, and the lawyer had told her that the partnership agreement Richard had shown her was not the agreement David had originally signed. There were 2 versions. The one David had signed gave his estate the right to retain his shares for up to 3 years following his death. The one Richard had shown Margaret, the one she had signed, did not include that clause. Someone had removed it. She had confronted Richard. He had listened to everything she said. He had sat across from her in his office, at the company's headquarters near Square One, and he had let her finish, and then he had told her, very calmly, that she had no proof that the agreement she had signed was legal and binding, and that if she continued to pursue this, she would spend what remained of David's life insurance money on lawyers and lose anyway. And then he had called her building's property management company because Richard was a part owner of the building where Margaret and the children lived, a detail she had not known until that moment, and he had given notice on her behalf, forging her signature on the termination of lease agreement. She had come home from that meeting to find a notice on her door. 60 days. She had nowhere to go that she could afford. The settlement she had received for David's shares, the amount Richard had decided was fair, was not enough to put down a deposit on a rental in the current market and maintain any kind of financial stability. She was a dental hygienist. She made a decent living, but not the cockleek that absorbed shocks like these without consequence. She had not called me sooner, she said, because she had been ashamed, because she had not wanted me to know that she had signed something without reading it carefully enough, because she thought she could handle it herself. She looked at me then, and her voice broke for the first time since she'd started talking. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," she said. "I know how much you love Richard. I didn't want to Stop, I said. I said it gently, but I said it firmly. I got up from the table and I went to the window and I looked out at the backyard, at the oak tree David had helped me plant when he was 19 years old. It was bare now in the November cold, the branches dark against the orange glow of the city sky. I thought about my son. I thought about the firm handshake Richard had given David at the partnership signing dinner. I thought about the toast Richard had made. I thought about the word brother and what I had believed it meant in our family. I turned back around. "You said the lawyer found 2 versions of the agreement," I said. "Does she still have copies of both?" Margaret nodded. "Good," I said. "You're going to call her in the morning. And I am going to make a phone call tonight. I want to explain something about myself, because it matters to what happened next. When my husband Gerald died 11 years ago, he left me the house, a modest savings account, and a 40% stake in a property holding company we had built together over 30 years. Gerald and I, with our own hands, starting with a single duplex in Hamilton we bought when we were both 29 years old and had almost nothing. By the time Gerald passed, we had 17 properties across southern Ontario. After he died, I sold 12 of them and retained 5. I kept the company structure. I kept the accountant. I kept the lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia, who had handled our affairs for 20 years and who did not suffer fools or fast talkers. I had never mentioned any of this to Richard, not because I was hiding it, but because Richard had never asked. He had always assumed, the way certain people assume, that a 63-year-old widow living in a modest house in Oakville with a vegetable garden and a standing order at the local Tim Hortons was simply a 63-year-old widow. He had never once asked me how I spent my time. He had never once asked what I did when I was not at his house for Sunday dinner. That was his first mistake. I called Patricia at 8:30 that night. I apologized for the hour and she told me not to be ridiculous and asked me what I needed. I told her everything Margaret had told me. There was a silence on the line and then Patricia said, "Eleanor, you understand what you're describing is fraud." "Yes," I said. "I do. The forged lease termination alone is a separate criminal matter from the document fraud." "I know. Do you want to handle this quietly? Or do you want to handle it completely?" I looked across the hallway at the spare bedroom where I had put Thomas and Claire, where the light was still on, and I could hear Margaret reading to them in a low voice, some story about animals in a forest, something gentle and ordinary that had nothing to do with any of this. "Completely," I said. The next 3 months were not quiet. Patricia connected us with a litigation lawyer named Desmond who specialized in corporate fraud. Desmond reviewed both versions of the partnership agreement and confirmed what Margaret's lawyer had suspected. The clause regarding estate retention of shares had been deliberately removed from the copy presented to Margaret. A forensic document examiner was retained. She determined that the 2 agreements had been printed on different dates, despite both bearing the same date in the header. The metadata from the law firm's own document management system, obtained through discovery, showed the modified version had been created 11 months after the original, 4 weeks before David's death. 4 weeks before David's death, That detail stopped me cold when Desmond read it to me across his desk in his office on Bay Street. I sat with it for a long moment. I did not say what I was thinking, but I thought it. Someone had been planning this before David was gone. The forged lease termination was reported to the Ontario Provincial Police. The officer who took the report was thorough and unimpressed with Richard's subsequent explanation that it had been an administrative error. Administrative errors do not replicate a signature with the precision that a forensic handwriting analyst later confirmed. Meanwhile, Patricia had been doing her own work. Because the building where Margaret had been living was partially owned by Richard through a numbered company, and because I happened to own a small commercial property 2 blocks from Richard's firm's headquarters, a property I had never mentioned to Richard, a property I had held for 9 years, Patricia approached the property management company with a competing acquisition offer on Richard's stake in Margaret's building. It was a clean, legal offer at market value. Richard needed liquidity. The fraud investigation had become known in certain circles, the way these things always become known, and 2 of his development partners had quietly pulled back from a project that was mid-financing. He sold his stake in the building to a numbered company that Patricia had structured 3 weeks earlier. Margaret did not have to move. The civil case proceeded. Richard's legal team was aggressive and expensive, and they filed every motion available to them. It took time. I will not pretend otherwise. There were months of it: depositions, document productions, hearings in a courthouse on University Avenue that smelled like old carpet and old arguments. Margaret sat through most of it with her hands folded in her lap and her spine straight, and I sat beside her, and we did not speak much during those sessions, because there was nothing useful to say. You just had to be present. You had to let the process work. There were hard days. There was a Tuesday in February. February is always the cruelest month in Ontario, when the cold stops being seasonal and starts feeling permanent, when Desmond called to tell us that Richard's team had filed yet another motion to suppress the forensic document evidence on a procedural technicality. Margaret was at my kitchen table when I took the call. I watched her face while I listened to Desmond. I watched her absorb it, the small flinch of it, the way she had to work to keep her expression steady because Thomas was doing homework at the other end of the table. When I hung up, she looked at me. "It's a delay tactic," I said. "Desmond says it has about a 30% chance of being granted. If it is, we find another path. We have other paths." She nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Eleanor, why are you doing this? Really? This must be costing you." "Margaret," I said, "David spent 6 years building that company with his brother. He invested his savings. He believed in it. And more than that, I stopped. I looked at my hands. More than that, he chose you. He loved those children. Whatever is in that company belongs to them. It always did. I am not doing anything except making sure what is theirs gets back to them." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "He talked about you all the time, you know. He said you were the toughest person he'd ever met. He said it like it was the best thing a person could be." I had to look away then. The motion was denied. The forensic evidence was admitted. In late April, a warm April, the kind Ontario gives you like an apology for February, the case was settled. I will not discuss the specific terms because they are subject to a confidentiality agreement, and I have given my word. What I will say is this: Margaret received full compensation for the undervalued shares, calculated at the correct fair market value as of the date of David's death, with interest. She received additional damages for the fraudulent lease termination. The numbered company that now held the stake in her building offered her a long-term lease at a fair rate with a right of first refusal to purchase. Richard did not go to prison. The Crown reviewed the file and determined that the evidentiary threshold for criminal fraud charges was not met, which is a frustration I have made my peace with. What I will say is that the civil judgment and the reputational consequences that followed in the development community were significant. His firm lost 2 major municipal contracts that had been in the approval pipeline. His remaining partner bought him out the following summer. I do not know what Richard does now. He does not call. I used to grieve that. I used to lie awake in the early mornings, in the gray light before the birds start, and feel the weight of it, not just David's absence, but Richard's choice, the particular loneliness of discovering that a person you raised and loved had made a decision like this. I gave both my sons the same home, the same values, the same oak tree in the backyard. I do not know how to explain why people turn out differently. I have stopped trying. What I do instead is focus on what is here. Thomas is 9 now. He has started playing hockey on Saturday mornings at the arena in Oakville, and I go to every game. I drink terrible coffee from the concession stand, and I sit in the cold rink with my scarf pulled up, and I watch him skate. He is not the best player on the team. He falls down more than some of the others. But he always gets back up immediately, without looking around to see if anyone noticed, and I think that is actually the important thing. Claire decided last month that she wants to learn to bake. We have been making butter tarts on Sunday afternoons, the proper kind, with a flaky pastry shell, the way my mother taught me. She takes it very seriously. She measures everything twice. She has David's precision, his way of doing things carefully and completely, and when I see it in her, it is both the hardest and the best thing. Margaret is well. She is more than well. She went back to school last fall, part-time evening courses at Sheridan, working toward a practice management certificate, so she can eventually move from clinical work into running a dental office. She comes for dinner on Thursdays. Sometimes she stays and we watch something on television, and she falls asleep on the couch with a cup of tea going cold on the end table, and I cover her with the blanket from the back of the chair and turn off the lamp and think about what it means to have family, not the family you are born into, not the names on a legal document, but the people who show up and stay. I want to say one more thing, because I think it matters. When Margaret sat on my front steps that November night, she apologized for coming to me. She thought she should have handled it alone. She was ashamed of needing help. I understand that feeling. I have felt it myself, in other seasons of my life, when I thought that asking for help meant I had failed somehow, when I thought that strength meant handling things alone. I was wrong about that, and I think she was too. The bravest thing Margaret did in all of this was not sitting through those hearings or signing the court documents or keeping her voice steady in the depositions. The bravest thing she did was sit down on my front steps and wait. She knew she needed help. She came to get it. And I was there. That is what I would say to anyone listening who is in a situation like the one she was in, who is sitting somewhere feeling ashamed of needing someone. The people who love you want to help you. Let them. There is no weakness in a child coming home. There is no weakness in saying, I don't know what to do next. Sometimes the person across the table from you has been waiting for exactly that moment. Sometimes they have resources you don't know about. Sometimes they have been through something that prepared them specifically for this. Sometimes the help has been there all along, in a house on a quiet street in Oakville, with a kettle on and a tin of shortbread in the second cupboard. You just have to come in from the cold.